In medieval times, living in a village was a whole different ballgame compared to today. Everything from the way buildings were constructed to the way society was structured was poles apart, and the villages were the bustling hubs of activity during those times. Today, we'll be spilling the beans on what it was really like to live in a medieval village. If you're a die-hard Game of Thrones or medieval-themed shows fan, you might be itching to know what life was like back then. In this video, we'll show you all the details about life in a medieval village. So let's get into it. Back in the day, villages were like tiny worlds where folks grew their own food and did whatever they could to survive. It was also a place where people got their worship on, with the church being the main attraction. And let's not forget about the village council of elders, who were basically the bosses of the joint. So yeah, villages were pretty much self-sufficient and had their own little governments. Villages were like fortresses with walls or hedges to keep outsiders from breaking in. These walls were also used to prevent the cows and pigs from running away and to stop unwanted guests from entering. And if you were lucky, your village would be close to a water source like a river or a stream, so you wouldn't have to go too far to fill up your water bucket. The locals would reside in cozy little huts with thatched roofs and made of wattle and daub. These charming abodes were usually centered around a courtyard or a green patch where the folks would cook, gossip, and scrub a dub-dub. The houses were so close together that you could hear your neighbor's snores, and the streets were so narrow and twisty that you could easily get lost. Forget about sidewalks. These lanes were more like a petting zoo, where animals roamed free like they owned the place. Medieval villages were like one big happy family, if that family were broke and surviving on homegrown grub. The villages were all about the farm-to-table life and had their little plots of land to grow their wheat, barley, and rye. And let's not forget their furry friends. Cows, pigs, and sheep were practically their pets that they eventually ate. In those days, life was as predictable as the changing seasons. Villages were like farmers on a never-ending treadmill, running from sunrise to sunset, chasing after their livestock and crops. And boy, was the work grueling. It's a wonder they didn't rename the village Sweat City, but at least the seasons knew how to give them a break. With shorter workdays in the winter, when even the sun couldn't be bothered to show up early. The sun would barely rise and the villagers would be up and at it, working like there's no tomorrow. Until the sun sets, that is. The women would juggle more tasks than a circus performer, cooking, cleaning, and wrangling the little ones. Meanwhile, the men were busy flexing their muscles with heavy work like plowing, planting, and harvesting. If that wasn't enough, they also fancied themselves as hunters and fishers, all in the name of a well-rounded diet. These tight-knit communities were all about agriculture and farming, which meant that the daily grind was literally a grind. But fear not, dear peasants, because they also found time to party it up with some good old-fashioned basic needs met in various ways. Church on Sunday, plowing on Monday, and who knows what mischief on Tuesday. In medieval times, gathering firewood, collecting berries, and fishing were the original Amazon Prime services. No need for 2-day shipping when you can get your goods straight from nature. And let's not forget about the village mill, where you could turn your grains into flour and become the MVP of the community bake sale. Move over, Betty Crocker. But the real rock stars of the village were the blacksmiths, carpenters, and other skilled tradespeople. They were like the original handyman app, providing all the goods and services the village needed. Want a new plow? The blacksmith's got you covered. Need a new chair? The carpenter's on it. These folks were the OG problem solvers. Back then, religion was as essential as a good cup of ale. The church was the center of village life, so much so that even the most educated person in the village was the priest. Sorry, school? Who's she? Sunday Mass was a must-attend event for the villagers, and the priest was a busy bee, performing all sorts of ceremonies, from baptisms to funerals. Talk about a one-stop shop. And let's not forget about the church being the ultimate party venue. Festivals, processions, you name it. But the medieval village was no walk in the park. It had a hierarchy so strict, even your grandmother's knitting club had more room for diversity. The lord and his family were at the top, followed by knights and the clergy, and at the very bottom of the social ladder were the poor peasants, who, let's face it, had to work hard for their bread and butter and pay rent to their lord. And they say millennials have it tough. The good old days when being a lord meant you could collect taxes, settle disputes, and maintain law and order. And let's not forget about providing protection from those pesky invading armies and bandits. It's good to be a lord, isn't it? Of course, in any village there's always a social hierarchy. At the top were the landowners, who had it all: property, power, and prestige. Then came the tradespeople, who were skilled in their craft and provided valuable goods and services to the community. And at the bottom of the totem pole were the peasants, who worked the land and paid rent to the lord. Hey, at least they had job security, right? Well, if you were a peasant living in a medieval village, you definitely knew your place in the social hierarchy. The lord's manor house was always smack dab in the center of town, while your humble abode was out on the outskirts. Talk about being on the wrong side of the tracks. But hey, at least you had some fun folklore and superstitions to keep you entertained. Who needs reality when you've got witches, ghosts, and other supernatural beings to spice things up? And let's not forget those exciting rituals and ceremonies to keep the evil spirits at bay. As for education, well, let's just say that being literate wasn't exactly a top priority back then. If you were lucky enough to be a wealthy male child, you might get some religious education from the clergy. But if not, well, there's always the school of hard knocks. Back in medieval times, medicine wasn't exactly cutting edge. If you got sick, your best bet was to rely on herbal remedies and good old-fashioned superstition. The village healer was like a wizard with their natural remedies, doing their best to patch up illnesses and injuries. Life in a medieval village was a whole different ballgame from what we're used to now. Despite the never-ending struggles of medieval village life, there were still moments of pure, unadulterated joy. Villagers would gather together to revel in festivals and holidays like Christmas and Easter, where they could feast, dance, and sing their worries away. And then there was the May Day celebration, where the villagers could frolic around a maypole adorned with flowers and ribbons and crown a May Queen to lead the festivities. It was the perfect opportunity for the young ones to find love and courtship, and you could bet that many marriages were arranged during this festival. Who needs modern dating apps when you've got a maypole? Life in a medieval village was like living in a constant game of plague bingo. Disease, famine, and war were always lurking around the corner, waiting to strike. The villagers had to contend with all sorts of illnesses, like the bubonic plague, smallpox, and tuberculosis, which were about as common as pigeons in a city park. Living in such close quarters and without proper sanitation was like asking for trouble, and epidemics were a frequent guest in the village. Sadly, the villagers had no effective way to treat or prevent these diseases, so it was just a matter of luck whether you lived or died. Well, it sounds like the medieval villagers were really living their best life with their trendy, primitive agricultural practices and reliance on a limited number of crops. Who needs variety when you can have a steady diet of turnip and gruel? And don't even get me started on those pesky weather conditions and pests. Talk about uninvited guests ruining the party. And let's not forget about the health benefits of malnutrition. Who needs a strong immune system anyway? All in all, it seems like the medieval villagers were really living their best life, with their limited food options and constant risk of starvation. Well, folks, that's a wrap on the medieval village life. It was all about working hard on the farm, warding off disease and raiders, and trying not to get burned at the stake for being a witch. But hey, they say whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And the villagers prove that by sticking together and finding joy in their traditions, even if those traditions involve dancing around a giant pole. So, if you want more fascinating history lessons, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. Who knows what wacky historical tidbits we'll uncover next?